Greetings, YouTube. I'm currently looking at a game called Wild Skies, and the premise is a diesel punk setting right after First World War or the Great War. Though the war stretched on longer than it did in our time, and the end results of the war were different than they were here. Now, that in and of itself isn't a stretch. I could very well imagine that history had taken a slightly different turn. The results of the first war would have been significantly different than they were. So we're there. I got no problem with that. The thing that stretches history too far for me is that this is our world. America, France, Germany, Belgium, yada, 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 all the history, exactly the same, all the same people, exactly the same, all the same technology with the one exception, which is some mysterious substance known as beryllium, which allows lighter than aircraft to be even more efficient, hence wild skies, lots of blimps and zeppelins and things. Um, but every single person in the world that in our world is a human is an anthropomorphic animal. And they give an entire list of animals. There's quite a few options. I think there were 40, I think there are 40 or 50 examples, and each one had subspecies. So there's lots of options. And of course, if you don't see one you like, you take very little effort to, you know, file the serial numbers off one of the existing ones and just give it a new name, and you could play that species if you wished. And that's too far for me. That gets into the range of, it just makes me incredulous. I'm like, no, I can't buy that. If you want to have a diesel punk setting with the same technology of the 1920s and 30s, with a little bit of, you know, weirdness thrown in with the beryllium, I have no problem with that. If you'd like to have it populated with a world full of anthropomorphic beings, 100 or 120 different species of animals, I got no problem with that. The fact that there are real animals in the world as well solves the problem of some settings, which were all the animals were anthropomorphic, which meant you had to kill people to survive if you were a predator. Never liked that idea. But this world also has non-sapient animals, just ordinary everyday animals like we have. Um, I, and again, that makes perfect sense to me. But if you're trying to overlay that kind of weirdness onto our world, that's where it breaks down. Um, you remember, anybody you ever read the Anita Blake books? I read a number of them uh, at one time. And I mean, they weren't bad stories, but they were kind of an excuse for soft core themes that didn't have much of a payout, really didn't. But the basic premise is that supernatural beings, as we know them, uh, zombies and vampires and werewolves and such are real, and they've always been real. In fact, at one point in the book, I think they encounter an Australopithecine who is a vampire, something like that. Um, but it's our history, our world, yada yada yada. I can't buy it. The second a supernatural being enters our world, that's where that timeline breaks off from ours. They are now no longer related to each other. They have nothing in common. You will not end up with any of the same people, the same nations, the same languages. Everything will be different. Okay? There'll be no similarities. I wouldn't even have a problem if Wild Skies wanted to use our world with the anthropomorphic animals, but you'd have to come up with completely new names and places and peoples for the world. So entirely new nations and new cultures and things, which isn't really all that more much different than what you do in a lot of settings, whether it's science fiction or fantasy. So I don't see a problem there. But for me, I can't buy it. It's like the masquerade in the world of darkness. I can't buy it. As soon as the first thing happens, everything's different. Um, Magitech for was it the alternity system? I think it was for one of CSR's attempts at a generic system, um, and it was our world, but with supernatural beings. It was like D&D on Earth, uh, but they had very similar nations and states and wars and things like that. And it was they had Hitler and World War II, except it ended up with this massive explosion because he committed this massive act of essentially necromantic magic, yada yada yada. Um, and I couldn't buy it. Again, first time somebody uses magic in the world, that's where our history ends and a new one begins. If you want to do urban fantasy, do urban fantasy. But it's going to have to be very subtle if it's going to be our world. And if it's not going to be very subtle, it has to be an entirely new world. One that doesn't have any connection to this one for me to be able to swallow it and not just think it's kind of silly. I'm always going to be trying to figure out why no one ever noticed this. I'm never going to get that out of my skull. Like the Buffy the Vampire universe, there's no way that all this crap wasn't known by everyone. Always. There's no way to hide this much stuff. Magic is so damn common in that setting. There are werewolves and vampires and supernatural beings and godlings walking the earth, and there's an entire superstructure of support personnel and stuff. It was a great little series in many ways, except for the fact that Wheaton is a shitheel. Um, but it was silly, and I could take it as kind of being silly, even though it also did some serious things and did some stuff that was interesting because it was silly. I couldn't, but if I'm going to immerse myself in that world, and now you're asking me to interact with it on the level of a role playing game, that's something different. I'll be picking apart that setting forever. I can't stop myself. It isn't necessarily that I want to do it. I don't want to spoil other people's fun, but my brain is not going to stop doing that. It's going to keep asking, yeah, but if that is so, that what? Uh, I'm never going to get around it. So if somebody wants to do a diesel punk setting with the technology of the 1920s and 30s, with a little bit of the weirdness thrown in and anthropomorphic animals, I have no problem with it. Just set it in a different world, and we got no problem. But if you're going to set it here and have magic be here, then the only way I can handle it and be completely immersed in it and buy it is if it starts now. Now, I've talked about that in the super settings. That only way I can handle a super setting without having to worry about the entire canon of an entire setting like DC or Marvel, or all the canon that even comes from like a fictitious setting Mutants and Mastermind came up with. They did a wonderful job with that. But it's a huge body of work that you have to kind of like absorb, and all your players have to absorb it. It's just so much work. Whereas if you have the super, if metahumans arrive on, you know, April 5th, 2025, I don't have to worry about the backstory. It's just our history. It's just that on that day, it branches off into a new direction, and we head off into new horizons. That I can do, because now you've split the streams, you split the timelines, and I can now go down that timeline without any problem, even though our timeline continues to trudge onward. So I guess what I'm asking you folks, how far can you stretch history? How far can you take it before you can't take it anymore? If you're okay with alternate history, but it's just humans on our Earth in an alternate history, okay, I can see that, not a problem with it. But when you start throwing magic or aliens or anthropomorphic creatures just being here all the time, that's where it breaks down for me. That it stretches it too far until it snaps. But I want to know, how far can you stretch it? Also, since we're on the topic, what is your favorite alternative history work? It could be novel, comic, series, movie, game, anything you want it to be. But what is your favorite alternative history work? I want to know what that is. I didn't think of that question until just now, so I didn't think about my answer. Maybe that'll be a different video in the future. So let's talk about stretching history and alternative history itself.